Okay, so hear me out. Hear me out. When did apples stop being organic? I know you guys are like, where's Shay going with this one? But just let's go on this adventure together. When did apples stop being organic? Just think about it. Just think about it. Roll with me, right? Because for thousands of years, every apple was organic. Every tomato, every head of lettuce, you name it. All of it was what we now pay extra to get the organic version of. But somewhere along the way, the default shifted. You know, industrial agriculture became so dominant that suddenly we needed special labels to identify food grown the way food has always been grown. Okay, so just hear me out, because if you're new to these voice notes, I mean, you're in for a lot of critical thinking out loud. But don't let me think by myself here. I want to hear from you. Leave a comment, because I want this platform to be a bit more conversational than some of my other content out here. But essentially, here is what we're all seeing right now. AI generated content is about to become so ubiquitous, so embedded in our daily experience that the default assumption will flip. Just like we now assume produce is conventionally grown, unless labeled otherwise, I think we'll soon essentially assume content is AI generated unless proven human made. And yeah, I don't know. I want us to sit with that for a moment, because this isn't some like distant future scenario I'm talking about. This is happening now. And I say this quite a lot, that AI isn't staying in the category of just a tool, right? Or just a product. I argue it's becoming infrastructure, you know, like Wi-Fi or the internet, right? I mean, we've seen multiple analyses and comparisons to the advent of the internet, right? And at some point we stopped saying something was Wi-Fi enabled, right? Or internet enabled. It just became the baseline assumption that undergirds everything that we do in the digital world. And we're seeing, in many ways, AI embedded in our email, our search engines, our creative software, our communication platforms, right? Like Microsoft, Google, Meta, all these big companies, they're all racing to make AI the invisible layer between us and our digital worlds, our digital lives, right? And in many ways, I mean, it's like, even when I'm reading research papers, I'm just like, what? Like, the capabilities are advancing at a pace that makes even the research papers I'm reading right now obsolete by the time I read them, and text generation is starting to become indistinguishable, sorry, from human writing. Images that fool expert photographers. Videos so real. I mean, come on, like, have you seen like videos so real that we don't even second guess them? And in many ways, voice synthesis, hey, that captures not just words but emotional nuances. I mean, come on, we're even seeing instances of ChatGPT coughing when responding to a user. I mean, this is all happening before our very eyes. And in many ways, we're already seeing the cultural reckoning begin. I talked about this in my 2026 AI predictions episode, which is the first voice note, I uploaded here. And this moment, where society has to grapple with what AI creation actually means. That's where we're at right now, you know? And it's not like any of this is new. Like, I always point to this story that happened in Japan in 2024. because I think it's a perfect example of where we're headed and some of the, questions that are coming up. So Ree Kudan, excuse me if I mispronounced her name, um, she is an author that won the Akutagawa Prize. I do not speak Japanese, so I apologize if I said that wrong. And if you're not familiar with this prize, it's one of Japan's most prestigious literary awards, and this is like a really big deal in Japan. And after winning the award during her acceptance speech, Gudan revealed that about 5% of her award-winning novel was generated verbatim by ChatGPT. She was open about it. She even said in her speech that, I plan to continue relying on AI in that manner in my writing. That's her words, right? And I don't know. I thought the reaction was fascinating. I was reading the different reports on it, and it seemed like the prize committee said that they knew AI had been used and that it didn't really affect their decision. They judged the work on its merits, and other reports said that people felt like, what she did was honest and refreshing. Others said that they felt deceived or uncomfortable. But here's what I find most interesting. The controversy wasn't really settled by knowing she used AI. It actually opened up more questions, because what does that actually mean anymore? 5%? What 5%? You know, um, which parts of the creative process? Does it matter if it's the dialogue versus the descriptions? The first draft versus the final polish. And I raise these questions, right, because I think we're so used to this binary framing. Either you typed a prompt and got final product, or you made it yourself. But that's not the reality we're living in anymore. For example, did you use AI if your word processor has AI powered grammar suggestions that you accepted? What about if you used an AI assistant to help organize your research notes? What if you wrote every word yourself, but you used AI to generate reference images for inspiration? What if AI helped you brainstorm, but you wrote the final draft? What if you wrote the draft, but AI helped you edit? What if AI translated your work, transcribed your voice notes, formatted your manuscript? Like you see where I'm going. Like there's just such a huge breadth of use cases that I've observed and that I've read about, that I'm just like, yeah, these are very it seems like granular questions I'm asking, but it's really just a matter of like, at what percentage does something stop being human made? At what point in the process does AI involvement count, so to speak? And honestly, who gets to decide? So these are more than just like rhetorical questions I'm throwing at you. These are actual questions that awards committees and publishers and galleries and museums and audiences are like grappling with right now. And they're going to have to come up with answers soon, because I truly believe like these old categories are slowly collapsing around us as this technology develops. And this is exactly why, we're already technically seeing attempts to create verification systems for human creation. So for example, because I I found out about this earlier this week. So Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, the company that made ChatGPT, he's also part of a company called World. It used to be called WorldCoin, I believe, but then they I think they rebranded in 2024. But what they're building is actually kind of wild. So they've created this device called the Orb that scans your iris, like literally scans your eyeball to verify that you're a unique human being. And it's basically like a verified digital identity that's cryptographically tied to your biometric data. Now, I mean, I already know what some of you guys are thinking, but let's think critically about this. One of the people most responsible for creating powerful AI systems is simultaneously building infrastructure to verify humanness. Come on. So that should tell you something about where, he thinks at least, this is all headed. And it's not just tech companies thinking about this, Like, I also want to point to the fact that the Authors Guild, which represents like actual working writers, is actively developing human authored labels for literary works. And, even they're recognizing, right, that as AI becomes more sophisticated and more integrated into the writing process, right, readers are going to want to know, did this come from a human mind? Is this based on human experiences? Does it really articulate a human struggle? But I think, here is where it gets like really complicated. And actually, I want to hear your thoughts on this because I'm thinking out loud with this one. When we create a human-made label, or human authored label is what they call it, for content or anything really, what standards are we actually certifying? Let's think through this together, because is it human made if you used, once again, for example, AI powered spell check? What about AI powered research tools that fetches them or summarizes those sources for you? What about AI for image compression or audio mastering? Technical processes that don't touch creative decisions, but are part of the final product. Do we measure it by percentage of AI involvement, like Rikudan's 5% that she mentioned? Do we measure it by which stage of the process AI was used in? By, whether AI touched the core creative elements? And once again, like, who defines what counts as core versus peripheral elements? And I'm not trying to be pedantic here. These are the actual standards that will shape what gets valued, what gets compensated, right? Come on. What elicits trust, and what gets dismissed, So these decisions and questions that I'm trying to raise, I think this is something we all collectively need to struggle with and deal with and think through. And honestly, and this is why I keep coming back to that organic food analogy, because I think we're about to go through the exact same messy process, right? So when industrial agriculture took over, it wasn't just about like efficiency or scale, right? I argue, at least, that it really fundamentally changed our relationship with food. It changed what we considered normal. It changed what our bodies were used to consuming, often without us even realizing it. And it took decades, literal decades, right, before we collectively said, wait, maybe we should know the difference, maybe origin actually does matter, maybe process, matters, especially in the age of processed food, right? But I think here's what people forget. Even with organic labels, we still have to define the standards, what counts as organic, what pesticides are allowed, how much contamination from neighboring farms is acceptable. What about the seeds? Do they have to be organic too? What about the fuel used to transport these vegetables and fruits and produce? These weren't simple answers. No, they were not, right? In many ways, they required negotiation, compromise, regulatory frameworks, multiple competing certification systems eventually emerged. And I mean, even now, there are different organic certifications with different standards, and people disagree about which ones are actually meaningful. And some people don't care at all. That's another thing I want to point out. Conventional produce is cheaper, it's more accessible, it looks fine. And at the same time, others are willing to pay double or triple for that organic label. And it's not because, for example, the apple looks different, but because the process matters to them, right? Because knowing where it came from matters, right? Because they're making a choice about what they want to support. And we're at the very beginning of that same process, I think, when it comes to content. Except, I don't know, I think it's going to be even more complex because unlike agricultural production and things of that sort, the boundaries are fuzzier and the pace of change is exponentially faster when it comes to AI, right? But okay, let me not ramble too much. Ultimately, here is why this matters. Unlike apples, content actually shapes our thinking. It shapes our culture. It shapes how we understand the world and each other. When we consume content, whether it's a news article, a social media post, a novel, a piece of art, or even like a casual conversation online, we're not just receiving information, right? We're encountering perspective, lived experience, human judgment, cultural context, right? The accumulated weight of someone's life experience filtered through their unique consciousness. Or at least we used to be able to assume that. Right? So what happens when we can no longer make that assumption? What happens when the default is synthetic content? Okay, so just imagine this. Right? So you read a novel about grief, right? That moves you to tears. It perfectly captures the specific devastating experience of losing a parent. You feel seen, you feel understood, you feel less alone, and then you find out it was generated by an AI that has never experienced loss, never had a parent, never felt grief. Does that change the meaning of your emotional response? Should it? Is the comfort you feel any less real? Is the insight any less valuable? I'm like flailing around. That's why I'm like knocking over my pen. I don't have easy answers to these questions I'm raising. I'm genuinely asking because I think this is something we all need to, think through and figure out together. And this is where I think we need to actually get intentional, right? Because standards don't just emerge naturally. I believe that they're shaped, they're negotiated, they're fought over. And right now in these early years is when the defaults, I believe, are going to be set. Because right now we're like in this weird transition moment where we're still debating whether AI content should be labeled at all. Some platforms require it, some don't. I mean, some creators volunteer the information, others don't. There's like no clear consensus right now. We're like in the wild, wild west of the early AI years, right? But I'm suggesting that we might be asking the wrong questions, right? So the question isn't whether AI content should be labeled, because soon enough, AI will be so integrated into so many processes that comprehensive labeling will be either impossible to enforce or so granular that it essentially becomes meaningless. Right? So then that means the question is, how do we create meaningful, verifiable systems for labeling human-made content? And more fundamentally, how do we define what human-made even means in an age of pervasive AI products, tools, assistants, things of that sort, right? And look, here's where critical thinking becomes absolutely crucial. Because listen, I okay, let me say it like this. This shift is going to happen whether we're intentional about it or not. Okay? And it's very clear that AI capabilities are advancing, right? Integration is accelerating. The economic incentives are massive, right? And at the same time, the convenience of using these tools are real, you know? The productivity, quote unquote, productivity gains can be quite substantial for some people. But ultimately, I don't know. I think we get to decide how we navigate this. I think we get to decide what we value. I think we get to decide what standards we set, and what future we're building. You know, do we create a world where human made content commands a premium, like organic food? You know, where people actively seek it out, pay more for it, build their identity around supporting it, you know? Or do we create a world where the distinction gradually stops mattering to most people? You know, where human creation almost becomes like a niche interest, like sort of how what's it called? Handmade crafts, you know, in an age of mass production became super appreciated by some people, considered quaint, you know, by others. But overall, you know, a comparatively small market compared to the mass market, you know? Or, and this is worth seriously considering, once again, I'm just throwing out ideas out here. Do we create a world where we stop caring about origin entirely and focus only on quality, utility, impact, regardless of source? You know, regardless of the source of the creation, you know? Will people start to find, for example, a piece of art beautiful, whether a human or an AI made it? Which of these futures will we inhabit? I'm not certain. You know, I often have more questions than answers, if you could not tell by now, you know? So, okay, let me bring this down to earth for a second, because I know I'm starting to ramble again. What does this actually mean for you right now in your life? You know, if you're a creator, you know, a writer, a musician, a designer, a knowledge worker, a thinker, you know, I think you need to start thinking about authenticity and verification in completely new ways. You know, how do you document your process? And I say this all the time. You don't have to document your process publicly, internally, externally. You know, it's up to you. But how do you prove you made something, right? And honestly, how much AI assistance can you use before your work stops being yours in any meaningful sense, right? Like these aren't hypothetical questions anymore. I think this is just the state of the world we're living in right now. And also on the other side of it, right? If you're a consumer of content, because at the end of the day, we all are. All day, every day, we're consuming something. I think we need to develop new literacy skills, you know? Not just like, oh, can I spot AI generated content, you know, but much deeper questions. You know, does it matter to me whether this was made by a human? Ask yourself that. In what context does it matter? Why does it matter? When am I okay with synthetic content and when am I not? You know, does it matter if your news article was AI generated, if it's factually accurate and well sourced? You know, does it matter if a painting was AI created, if it moves you emotionally? You know, does it matter if a song was made by an algorithm, if it becomes the soundtrack to, I don't know, like some of your most important memories, right? What about AI therapy chatbots? virtual AI companions. The list, it goes on and on. It's endless. But this is why I always encourage daily contemplation as part of a healthy thought life, right? Because you don't want to wait until it happens before you start contemplating the possibilities. So ultimately, here's what I want to leave you with. Should human made content carry a premium? Should we be building systems, right, to verify and value human creation differently? And if so, how do we define human made in a way that's meaningful, right, but also not like impossibly rigid? And maybe, most importantly, as AI becomes embedded in more and more of our tools and processes, at what point does I used AI stop being a meaningful disclosure? Because at the end of the day, if AI is in your spell checker, your search engine, your camera's image processing, your voice recorder's transcription, at what point is it just infrastructure? That's really, I mean, ultimately what I've been arguing for a while is that it's not just a tool, it's not just a product, it's becoming infrastructure. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't think there's one right answer here, because there's a wide array of people that watch and listen to my content, and that's why I really want to hear all the different perspectives and opinions on this, because I think this is one of those like philosophical tensions we need to hold and explore and to live with and to continually reassess as the landscape continues to shift beneath our feet. Because it's shifting. The shift is happening right now. And honestly, I've been feeling it for a while, because at the end of the day, I think when you see the way that standards are starting to be set, and organizations are already building verification systems, and artists and writers are already navigating these questions in real time, you know I think we just have to be more conscious and intentional about this transition, and to allow for more agency, and understanding that we all have a role to play in shaping what comes next. And really, this is ultimately the work of critical thinking, in the age of AI. It's not just understanding the technology, but understanding what it means for us, for our culture, for what we value, for how we relate to each other. The implications are truly endless. So, what are your thoughts on all of this? Because I know I sort of just like really just started rambling. But ultimately, yeah, do you think we need that organic label for human made content? Right? So drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this episode with someone who needs to, I don't know, like think about all the gazillion questions I just threw at you. I don't know. Send it to the group chat. Argue about it over dinner. Because this isn't like something one person can answer alone. Really, it's something we need to figure out together as a society, as a culture. So yeah, keep thinking critically. Until next time.